Bonjour y'all, Adrian Lambert here. Today I want to try and clarify the copy-to-point workflow. That is basically a system for instancing that is supposed to be the latest and greatest way to instance object in Houdini efficiently. So what is instancing? It's just a system that is memory efficient for you to have millions of objects duplicated without adding more polygons into your scene. So that's a very important concept to understand. In the past, a few of my tutorials were using the copy stamp. And actually, a few of you guys have been asking me, okay, now that the copy stamp disappeared in 19.5, how do you handle instancing? And copy to point will be the way to go. The first thing I'll grab is the side effects documentation. One thing to understand, the instancing point attribute is relying on a bunch of attributes to basically drive the scale, the orientation, and all that good stuff, right? So for example, orient is a great one to drive the orientation of your object. P-scale is basically the uniform scale. Scale is driving the non-uniform scale. Let's say you want to drive some variation in Y so that things are a bit more or less flat, right? So that sort of things. And then you have normal, up, V. There's one thing that's pretty important to understand though, is that all of these attributes, you don't necessarily need all of them. That really depends what you need. There is in Houdini some priorities set up to drive the instancing of your objects. You don't have one way to drive your instancing. You have actually a couple of them. The first one being driving the rotation by a transform. So a transform with a matrix like 3x3 would drive the rotation. I don't think it contained the scale, but the scale of a 4x4 matrix would be driving the copy and instancing in that case. Then again, you have other solution to drive rotation. The second one, if you don't have any transform attribute within your point system, that's fine. In that case, Houdini is going to try to find if there is an orient attribute. An orient attribute is a quaternion. And yeah, then again, that's another thing. It's important to understand the concept of quaternion. So if I want to make this simple, that would be the equivalent of driving the rotation. Let's say, take a piece of paper. You take like an object that would stick into a direction. So this direction would influence in what way you will want to pivot the object. So in that case, if I stick this pen in this sheet from the top and I angle this pen, it would basically then rotate the whole thing in that direction. So yeah, very advanced stuff, isn't it? If I pin it like this way, for example, it would drive the rotation this way. So we have sort of two parameters. We have one direction, one vector that's driving where you pin the object, and the other one is an angle that is, I think, in radian, that would drive the rotation. So yeah, that's basically what a quaternion is in a nutshell. And if you don't have an orient attribute within your point, you basically have another solution, which is to drive the orientation based on the normal direction and also the up vector as well. So it's telling us using n as the z-axis and up as the y-axis. So we'll see how we can use that. I think that would be the most simplest way for beginners to approach orientation within a scatter system. And yeah, of course, there's other ways. There's also the rotation attribute that exists that you can use to actually drive rotation. So yeah, I think that's, we're going to try and mostly make use of, I think, orient and normal and up vector maybe in this video. Then when it comes to the scale, you have the P scale that's driving the scale of the instancing. If you're using a transform, that's why the transform is like has more priority within the scatter system, is that the matrix by 4 by 4 would actually contain the information of the scale already. In that case, I think we will try rather use the p-scale, which is easier to edit. And same, if we need a local axis transformation, let's say in Y, to squeeze or stretch an object, we could make use of the scale. So yeah, you have like some example how you can drive that in Vex in here. Yeah, I really encourage you to read this documentation that will give you more information about the rotation, give you some more example, etc. So let's see how that would work. So I hope this wasn't too intimidating. I just wanted you to be aware that this attribute will help you drive your instancing there. So let's see how that goes. We're gonna first create a geometry. And in there, I'll create a curve. So we'll just start with a simple curve and try to, well, instance something along the way, right? So I'll use a grid snap and start to draw some path. Something like that. I don't know. Let's resample to add more point. So I will drop this resample sub. And if I display the point number, we're adding way more points here. Let's see if we subdivision curve. That's somehow not really reacting as I expected, but in the meantime, that will do. Let's use that and try to use the copy to point. So let's say we want to make, I don't know, just replacing some points there. So that would be the target point. And in this first input, we would need to feed the geometry that we want to use there. So let's use maybe a test geometry, like a bunch of rubber toy. Yay. Let's use that. So right now, by default, we see that our objects are not instanced, right? Because we have all these points visible, which is absolutely not great to for instancing. See that the amount of polygon is 200K. That's absolutely not acceptable. So let's just pack an instance. And all of a sudden, we have only 17 points. And what it's doing is just generating the mesh of one of this rubber toy and, well, basically instancing it, well, putting that into the memory to compute all the 17 clones of this guy, if that makes sense. Now that we have that, maybe we want to, you know, play with some feature like driving the scale, driving the rotation, right? They are all facing in the same direction. So far, okay, let's see what we can do here. If we would want to rotate them 90 degrees, well, either you could put a transform in here and say you want to rotate 90 degrees. That would be one option. But you can also specify some attributes that you would put on the points, as I explained earlier, right? So, for example, since it's a curve, we have this node orientation along curves that exactly help us create some attributes for curve. In that case, you see that it helps us lining up and following the tangent of the curve. So that's why everything is based on the average of edges direction. We have also slightly different mode that would basically do the same thing. Z-axis, well, it would just ignore everything. And yeah, you have the target up. As I said, what it's doing is creating two attributes, up and N. That would be the most basic one to sort of drive the orientation of objects. Up would drive the Y axis, while N would drive the Z axis. That's basically the idea. So if I put that to Z, everything is like turning in another direction. Same for X, it's going to point over there. So if you want to make sure things are basically pointing up, it would drive the target up vector to Y. Hopefully that makes sense. And yeah, the node also offer additional stuff like adding some extra rotation. So you can always sort of override things, right? If you want to control that. Yeah, you can have all this to sort of really control the rotation here. So sweet, and same for the scale, but actually, you know what? The scale, I would rather use another method, which would be to create our own p-scale. So the way that would work, we could do either that with vex, with point_vop, or just with sup. Like, you can totally use an attribute create and say, I want to set the p-scale, and you have to make sure it's a float, okay? And by default, the value is 0. That's why they all disappear, right? If I set that to 1, the value is the default size of the object. If I set that to 2, it's going to basically double it. That's as simple as that. If I set 0.5, we will have half of the initial size of this object. So that's driving the uniform scale. And of course, we are not forced to basically have everything at the same size. We can use some attributes, let's say from the resample, like we have the curve view. That's always a useful attribute to have, that just remap the beginning and the end of the curve from a values to 0 to 1, which means that we could basically do an attribute modify, attribute, what's the name of this one? I never remember. I usually do everything either with vex or vop. Attribute edit, maybe? Attribute remap, yeah, let's try that. So attribute remap could basically take curve view and say new name is going to be p-scale. Yeah, so we can basically delete this guy. And all of a sudden we see that we can remap everything based on the curve view attribute. So that's pretty neat. The input minimum would basically sort of clip the values below, let's say 0.5. And now the beginning of the curve basically start at 0.5. And they all get bigger from this point. But of course, you can play with the output min, output max to drive the scale. So pretty neat. And you're not forced actually to have like something uniform. You can use this curve to drive the whole freaking scale of all this. So all of a sudden we break up the scale pretty nicely, right? So that's pretty convenient. If we would want to randomize on top of that, basically we have an attribute randomizer, and we are not forced to let this guy to set values. We can also add values on top of that. By default, it's trying to, well, set some attributes on the color CD, but we could say, I want to use the p-scale. And then, as you can see, the set value is sort of overriding everything. So what we'll do here is just use add values. And all of a sudden, well, that's a bit much, I would say, because it's trying to add a value of 1 on top of everything. So it's hard to see. But if we set the minimum value to 0 and the maximum to 0.3, for example, it would try to randomly assign a value between 0 and 0.3 to any of these numbers, any of these clones. And you can drive the seed just in option, and you notice that they all sort of get randomized. So that's a fairly convenient way to deal with the p-scale. And you can actually use these techniques to also, well, randomize, let's say, the scale y. And the way that would work in that case, we would use the scale attribute, as we saw in the documentation right here, was telling us that scale would be the attribute for non-uniform scale, okay? So let's have a look. Right now, everything is squeezed because this attribute randomize is set to add values. Let's set value. And yeah, the minimum value is basically 0 everywhere. And this was 0.3, so that's a bit weird. Could leave that to 1 and 1 in here. And now we are controlling sort of random variation in y. And yeah, that would basically allow you to squeeze from 0.5, the original size, to double the size, for example. So that's if you need to, well, control some scale variation non-uniformly. All right, so that's pretty neat. What else could we talk about? Yeah, we haven't talked about orient attribute. That's actually a good one to talk about. Let's say we want to also, yeah, randomize rotation, right? That's an important point. So orient, maybe we have, you know what? Actually, let's use an attribute randomize, and let's try and randomize maybe n. So I will randomize the normal, and you will see that the rotation all of a sudden get pretty random, but it's always sort of in the same direction because, well, that's it's a bit more difficult, I guess, if you want to tweak things this way. And that's where I think like driving the rotation with quaternion makes things slightly more easily. But maybe you also have some other nodes like orient. Orient attributes, yeah, let's have a look at that one maybe. So initial rotation, we could use n and up. Maybe let's force y up. How do that work? Yeah, you basically have some sort of randomization possible with this guy. So you're not forced, obviously, to randomize. You can also set absolute values. That's totally fine if you want to really control the rotation over here. But note that you can actually randomize stuff from here as well. Tja. So fun stuff. And you also have an orient mode, as I was saying. So you're not forced to actually have just n and up. You can also create an orient attribute, which is a quaternion. In that case, the instancing would take over the rotation based on the orient, and it would disregard up and n. So that's one important thing to sort of understand. Now, if you wanted to use what you already set up in n and up and somehow convert that into orient, you can always do that in Vex. I won't get into detail about that, but okay, let's say you really want to reuse that, okay? You could always set an attribute wrangle and yeah, basically use something like that. What it's doing, it's first creating a matrix by 3 by 3 using this n and up vector. And it's turning this matrix into a quaternion. So it's not actually directly converting those two into a quaternion. It's first converting it into a matrix and then converting that into a quaternion. So yeah, that's basically how that works. In that case, you'll see that if I delete the attribute n and up, I think it would still work. Up and normal, yep, that one. And it still worked because, well, it's now driven by the orient, and we can always sort of tweak that with more either Vex or VOP. Actually, you know what? I like to use VOP for some stuff, just because if you want to use a noise, let's say to add variation into the rotation, that's actually an interesting option to have. So you can import a quaternion with a bind. So let's bring the orient and we're going to edit it a little bit. So to do that, we'll re-export obviously the orient into another quaternion called orient. And you know what? It's not, yeah, no, it does seem to pick up the attribute. So let's just make sure we're going to Q-multiply. You can't use a multiply to multiply two quaternion together. So I usually use Q-multiply. And right now we don't have any second one, right? So let's create a custom quaternion that we will multiply with the current one. So to do a custom quaternion, you can drop, well, a quaternion. It needs two things. It needs an angle. It needs also an axis. As I said earlier, you have like the example with the paper. You have the angle, the axis in which direction you want to basically plant the stick into the paper sheet. In that case, let's say Y going to stick this way, and angle will drive the amount of rotation you need here. So awesome. Let's just define that. The angle, as I said earlier, needs to be in radians, which is nobody uses radians in real life, right? So we'll need to convert the degrees into radians. So we'll create a parameter that we'll call just like angle, very original. And this one will set the float range to 360 and will, of course, convert to radiant. So it's degree to radians. So you have a function for that. That's beautiful. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to convert that. And yeah, let's put that into angle. So one good thing down. Now we need the axis. Let's just drop another parameter so that we can control that upstream. I'll call that axis, and it needs to be a vector. And the default value, I'll set it in Y. Neat. So just with this, we can Q-multiply, and let's see what we get. So far, it's just picking up the original orient that we set up. That's just following the curve, but we can now add an extra angle to it. And not only that, but we could actually randomize it a little bit. So to do that, we could just take the point number. So let's just use random. And we'll take the ptnum, we randomize it, so it will assign a random value between 0 and 1 to each of these points. You can obviously, well, sort of change the seed very simply just by adding an extra parameter that you will call seed. So let's say you want to change a little bit the system, you could just put an integer that you will call seed. Yeah, something like that. And let's multiply the initial value of this angle by these guys right here. So I will expand my window so that you all can see what's going on. So that's my custom quaternion right here. So let's make it nice and clean. That would be the random value. And yeah, this would basically drive the quaternion, the custom quaternion that we are multiplying by the original quaternion. So just like that, we managed to get random values. If we would want some to go in other direction, because we see that they all rotate toward the same direction, we could also refit the values not to go between 0 and 1, but between, let's say, -1 to 1. And all of a sudden, we see that as we increase this angle, some are gonna go in one direction and the other will be in another one, if that makes sense. So that can be a nice way to sort of randomize stuff a little bit. So yeah, that's, if you understand that, really, that's pretty much all you need to understand, I think, in terms of manipulating attributes. With just that, you are able to, well, control, yeah, the scale, control the rotation. What else? Well, the point, well, if you need to sort of display stuff, obviously, you can use the P attribute, obviously. So we could use vector to float. And with that, we could add a custom, then again, a random number to add in Y. So I will reconstruct this vector. So we'll just say float to vector. Yeah. And let's just add all these guys back together. Just we'll add maybe a value in y that's going to be random. Yep, and we'll change the position, the p attribute. So p attribute will control, well, the sort of position of all those points, right? I will just probably, yeah, I will duplicate these guys right here. And I will call that seed B or seed position. Yeah. And like the value, we'll just fit that in here. Yep. And we see that they now randomly translate in Y. So I will expose this destination max so we can control that. But yeah, seed position, we see now they have all different heights. Oui. Ok. Tout va bien. Du coup, let's keep going. I think we are pretty close to finish, I think. One thing that I want to show you is basically scattering, just some tricks that you can use. Obviously, we have been using a curve all along. Let's say we have some, I don't know, surface geo with maybe a bit of noise, stuff going on. So let's see what we could do here. Let's increase this guy. Yep. Something like that, maybe, I don't know. So we'll scatter some points. And yeah, let's reuse this system. So right now, everything has the same values, the same look. That's not great. Let's say we want to have a scale of this guy that is based on the height of the terrain. So if we would really want to do that, let me expand. I will keep this on the side for now. And we could create an attribute based on mask from, you know what? Let's drop a point VOP. Sorry, point VOP, not a .NET, point VOP. I usually like to take relative to bounding box. That would extract, well, the bounding box of the geometry and remap everything, every axis between 0 to 1. In that case, if you vector to float to extract the different axes, you can extract the y-axis. And we could try and export that into, let's say, the scale, p-scale. And now we see that, yeah, we basically have the scale of these clones that are driven by the height of this geometry. Now that's sort of tricks that I like to use in making forest, things like that, right? And yeah, you can always remap it, you can add some noise, you can do all kinds of things. So that's the beauty of Houdini, is that it's very procedural and you can design anything with noise, with all the functions that are available. So yeah, that's actually pretty neat. Let's say we want a ramp parameter. Let's just make sure to set that to spline and we'll call that remap. In that case, yeah, we can really change the look based on the height. So fun stuff. Trying to find other stuff that I could show you. Well, obviously we could introduce some variation in terms of axis. Right now there's nothing because it's expecting this orient attribute to exist, which right now in the system doesn't. You see that this is just no orient attribute, right? It's just p and p-scale. So if you multiply something that doesn't exist, like basically it has a value of 0, Well, it's not gonna do anything. In that case, I can get rid of that and just set my orient. And now we have some random rotation. Whee! Yeah, fun stuff. So that's seat position, that's a seat for rotation. Now, yeah, there's more. If you really need to change the shape of these guys, that's one thing I haven't mentioned yet. If you, let's say, need a pig head, let's merge these guys. Actually, how's that gonna go here? As soon as you want to replace objects by other, well, you will need these guys to be packed first. So we'll make sure those are packed. And you know what? There's a detail that's important as well, is to make sure that things are packed, but, oh wow, that's pretty glitchy here. What's happening? Yeah, that's more what I expected. You see that the pack by default is set in centroid, which might not always be the right thing, because let's say you are scattering trees. If your centroid is based on the middle of the tree, it means that as soon as you're gonna copy them, they're gonna be sort of planted by the middle instead being planted by the base of the tree. That's why I usually set that to origin, and it makes sure that the pivot of the object is gonna be at, well, the grid, right? And same for this guy. Well, right now he's sort of set below, which is not ideal. So maybe we would want this guy to be a bit more fitting above the grid. So you could basically match size that and say, I want this dude to fit like so. And same, we'll pack this guy so that the pivot is at the origin of the grid. So that's an important gotcha when it comes to scattering. Well, not scattering, instancing, sorry. And, well, both actually. So based on that, how do we randomize the shape? Well, basically you see in the copy to point, we have this piece attribute, and what it does, it expects an integer or a string to drive which shape to assign. So by default, it would try to look for something called name, and it has to be on the point. So fair enough, we could basically create an attribute that is called name on those points. So let's just create this name attribute. And you know what? Well, okay, let's just use that for now. We'll set it to integer because it said it expected an integer, right? So if we have this, we now can control the shape based on the value of this attribute. So name attribute, value of 0 is driving this guy, value of 1 driving this guy. And of course, the more object we add, the more we can, well, replace them. I don't know what else. Test geo. Let's get freaking, where is this octopus? Squab. Squab. The name is funny. Squab. Squab. So yeah, let's say we have this octopus dude, Squab. Let's see. If I set the value to 2, we have Squab. Bunch of damn, that's a nightmare. So many octopus. Oh my god. I'm a bit thalassophobe, so yeah, for me seeing that many octopus, that's scary. Scary. So now how do we randomize this number? Well, we could basically use an attribute randomize instead of an attribute create. That was just to show you how this thing is basically working. Obviously, you also notice the CD attribute is also sort of contributing to randomizing, like in that case, various color to these guys. But what I want is the name attribute, and we'll set that to a custom discrete. So the advantage of that, it offers a system of weight where you can say, I want a value, well, the ID 0 to have a certain weight, ID 2 to have a certain weight. And at this point, it's mostly like a probability system where we have 100% assigned pretty much everywhere, value of 1. If you increase it to 10, for example, it will try to put 10 times more of this ID2, in that case, the octopus, those freaky dudes. If I don't want to see them, I set them to 0, and all of a sudden it's just gonna reshift the system to have 50% of ID 0 and ID 1. So yeah, pretty neat. And if you want maybe less pig, well, 0.5 of these, and you have a bit more of these rubber toys instead. You know what? There's one thing, maybe we don't actually need to pack instance at this point because things are already packed. Don't necessarily quote me on that, but I'm not sure if there is any real benefit of double packing geometries here. Anyway, so at this point you have a system and you can use this global seed if you need to change the shape. So that's the main thing. We haven't talked much about the use of normal in that case. Well, let's say we would want those heads, those guys, to basically orient it based on the normal direction of, well, this terrain right here. Okay, well, that means we would first need to define this normal, and I would usually use a facet. So I can use these post-compute normals to drive the creation of this normal attribute. Beautiful stuff, right? And in theory, these attributes being also transported on the points as soon as it's scattered. So neat. Like in theory, those points have normals, and that will drive the orientation. Just, you know what? Let me disable the orientation though. So let's disable this guy. And as you can see, everything seems a bit messed up, right? Part of it, we don't have an up vector. Could use attribute create attribute, yeah. And let's set an up vector. Yep. So let's use the up, and the default will be y in y. It's still not quite fixed. Let me check what we have. Bscale and up. And yeah. Could just be we just rotate the whole system right there. Yep. And in theory, well, everything would sort of align with the normal of the terrain. It could be easier to visualize that with just a line system, actually. And we'll set that in Z. Yep. So yeah, we do see how things follow the normal of the terrain. Neat stuff. Because without that, it would be, well, in the Z direction, right? And yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to show you here. Hope this is enough information to get you started on the copy to point, and it gives you a better idea how you can use it instead of the copy stamp. So I know this is sort of a bit of a different way to work here, but do remember that having all the attributes on the points first is actually much more beneficial down the line to deal with instancing. Performance will be much faster, and I think that's why SideFX is sort of enforcing this way to work. So that makes things much cleaner, I guess, for instancing. So if you have any question, do let me know in the comment. I will try to answer as soon as I'm back from vacation, or maybe from vacation. I will be back home in France in the middle of, well, the countryside, so Wi-Fi is a bit tricky to get there sometimes, so yeah, I might take a bit of time to reply. So stay tuned, and I'll see you guys very soon.